right, this is a fireside chat.
This is our fireside chat. So let's assume there's a fire right here. No, so that was amazing. Thank you, Frank. So, as someone who's been in the private sector, what is it like now to play the role of a regulator?
You know, it's an interesting transition. In the private sector, and in particular, the role that I was in, you know, world's largest company, when you ask vendors or suppliers to do things, they did it because they wanted to sell product. But now it requires you to be a little bit more thoughtful on what's what I call shared value. What's in it for me? I know you want me to do this, but how does it benefit me? How does it benefit society? And so it takes a little bit more thoughtfulness on trying to persuade people to do things. And you talked about this in your presentation. You know, having led one of the largest bodies of work using blockchain to promote greater food traceability and transparency. Can you talk about some of the challenges in record keeping and data sharing in food? Yeah, I mean, I went through that pretty quickly. Just imagine how big the food system is and all of the records being on paper. I mean, we really don't know what we should know about the food system. And the idea or notion, if you started digitizing that, converting some of that into information, while we think the food system is pretty efficient, I can tell you with humble authority what I've seen working at a pretty large retailer with very sophisticated supply chains. Small tweaks or enhancements on supply chains make big differences. A single SKU, which is a single food product, you just enhance it by just a couple of percentage points. It results in, you know, tens of millions of dollars being saved in food waste. And so we need to get on with digitizing the food system. There's no question about it. You guys are all technology experts. You know, there's a reason why so many other sectors of society has been digitized and food hasn't. It's margins, but I think the curve is now bending, and I do believe that in the next 5 years we'll see a lot more digitalization of food.
And then what is it specifically about blockchain or artificial intelligence, machine learning that allows for the traceability, the transparency of these into these supply chains? What is it?
I think it's just taking data and the ability to convert it into information. But I want to emphasize again today that it isn't the technology, it's the, you know, whether in your private sector, you'll say the business problem you're trying to solve. Here, the societal or public health challenge you're trying to solve. Blockchain, because we need to create a more digital and traceable food system. That's the goal, and you can't do it on paper. Artificial intelligence, if you think about, I'll give you an example of a pilot that we announced a couple of weeks ago on imports. Imports in the United States, while by and large, about 15% of the food that Americans eat is imported. In reality, it's not as large as people think. In certain areas, it's much higher. Seafoods are 94%. But imports are increasing exponentially year after year. And when you think about this exponential growth in import lines, the solution might not be throwing more inspectors at it, trying to do more checks at port, but it's about using tools such as AI to make sure that when we're actually putting or deploying resources, we're deploying it on the products that we think are of highest risk. And so, for example, AI to me is trying to create better predictive capabilities to make sure that we send our resources to the right places at the right time. And so the emphasis is not on the technology, but the business problem that you're trying to solve. But I have no question that some of the digital tools that you guys are working on and promoting give me promise to solve some of the public health challenges that I imagine, I never thought we could solve them in the past 30 years, and now I believe, because of these tools, we can.
And then, you know, I think it's very clear that you've been an ardent supporter of new and emerging technologies. How do we use new and emerging technology to create new models of trust?
Yeah, I love that question, Combiz, because distributed ledger technology and blockchain, not only do I think it's an applicable technology for traceability scale, because I think I persuaded you, the food system is very fragmented, decentralized, and distributed food system that mirrors the architecture of blockchain. But I do think one of the biggest things there, and it's a deeper thought, is the promise of distributed models of trust. Let me just end on this. I know we're going to be short on time. What does Romaine lettuce, the financial crisis, political scandals, which, by the way, I understand they don't happen in DC. They happen in small towns across America. That's the joke. But what do those things have to do with each other? transparency, trust. They've all created these big knocks on consumer trust. And you can read the reports, whether it's the Edelman Trust Barometer. Consumers are becoming less trusting of institutions, of people, of organizations, of companies. And they tend to be these single points of failure. If you think about technology, we thought technology was going to be bringing this new era of transparency. We're going to trust them. And now we don't even trust the technology firms because they've taken our data and they've sold it. But blockchain, in its kind of foundation, is the idea that they're a distributed model. There is no single governing authority, so you won't have a single point of failure. And if you could create these blockchain ecosystems the right way, so that you have different nodes or actors, I think some technology providers refer to them as trust anchors, that involve the public sector, the private sector, the academic sector, you might create a model of trust that's distributed in nature and provides a systems of checks and balances. And so I do believe as a society, we're living in really this era of amazing lack of trust, that society will experiment with new distributed models of trust. I'm convinced of this. And I think blockchain at its very heart kind of tackles this notion of distributed trust. Now, the federal government is actually founded on that, right? The principle of, checks and balances. Laughing, so no, it doesn't really work that way. So anyways, I think it's a good question, and think about that. How do we create these solutions in a way so that they're trusted and so that we don't find ourselves, right back to where we were 10 years ago with new digital technologies and the web, and we find ourselves right back to people not trusting.
And then how do we ensure then that the technologies create shared value?
Shared value is another concept that's really important, and that's one of the roles I think solutions will scale. If you think about the old centralized database that I was talking about, a big bad retailer or a big bad food service company asks their suppliers to get in a digital centralized database, declare your products, where you get your ingredients from, and I benefit because I can run a smarter supply chain and outcompete the rest of the world. Creating shared value, that's another thing that I think blockchain does. It democratizes information. If you get into that ecosystem, it's your data. You own the data, you permission who you want to share it with. And an example I gave, the way we created shared value with mangoes, mango suppliers, farmers told me, we'll get in. When there's a food scare, what happens? Everybody's guilty until proven innocent. And then once the regulators figure it out, we realize, hey, it wasn't everybody's mangoes. It was one farmer's mangoes. So they said, we'll get in, it's an insurance policy. The processor told me, literally, exact words, I'd like to participate. He said, especially if you could add temperature monitoring, because when my mangoes don't make shelf life, I always get blamed for it. And I'm not sure it's me or the transporter or the distribution center or what happens in the store. And so it's not about fault finding, but it's about fact finding, and I'll know truly where the breakdowns are occurring. The consumer benefits because they want to know where their products came from, and they'll get a fresher product, presumably. And so it's this idea, and the regulator benefits, because now they have transparency on how products are moving. It's this idea that you try to create solutions so that everyone in the ecosystem gets value out of it. It makes it a lot easier to scale, as opposed to you pushing a technology initiative that only one participant in it benefits from. So shared value is such an important concept for the 21st century.
I have a few more questions, but I want to give a chance for the audience to ask questions as well. And I believe we have a mic going around or two. Yes, we do in the back. First question, Colin.
Thank you very much. My name is Jim Liu. I teach cryptos and blockchains at Johns Hopkins, so this is amazing, that you actually implement this at Walmart. One of my questions is, it looks like you were very successful with mangoes, right? So has Walmart sort of adopted this methodology for, the many, many different SKUs there? And then, the other question I have is, going from paper to digital makes a lot of sense to me, right? What I have a problem sort of teaching is, how do we get the sort of permissionless blockchain working? And have you ever seen sort of that really working in the industry or in the government?
Okay. Yeah, so when I left, we had scaled and this all went pretty quickly. It went amazingly quickly, from the mangoes to about 25 plus SKUs. And then right before I left, I was wanting to join the agency, but I wanted to get one thing done there before I left. So we sent a letter to all of our, what we called fresh leafy green suppliers, the ones that you've seen in these types of scares. And Walmart is requiring them to be on a blockchain-enabled traceability solution by the end of September of this year and have end-to-end traceability. And what we've seen is just an explosion. Carrefour, one of the world's largest retailers based out of France, they're scaling it in their solutions. And all you have to do is search. It's really starting to hit a tipping point. I think we've gone beyond this notion that it's hype, and people are actually, Nestle, one of the world's largest food producers, implementing it for baby food. And so there are a lot of people doing this. So it is truly starting to scale. And it's no longer, they're not pilots, they're actual production cases. Permissionless, what's going to happen? I don't think permission blockchains are a bad thing. People think it's either all public or private, and I don't even like to call it that. I think these enterprise blockchain solutions can benefit the public sector. Of course, people are going to get in there and they're not going to share everything. They're not going to let you see everything because some of it, but permission blockchains are great, which is I produced this product, I'm selling it, and so as a consumer, I might see how that product got from the farm to table continuum, but the producer might not want to share exactly what they're sending to Walmart with another retailer. And so I think we have to be very comfortable with exploring enterprise blockchain solutions because that's the way they're going to scale, and not automatically cast a negative light on them, that if it's not totally open public, it's a bad thing.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. You said that you'd wish you'd given a different answer when asked what's government's role. You listed a bunch of new questions. I'd like to know what you think your answer is now, and particularly from the role of the FDA as a regulator. Is it to join consortia with other businesses? Is it to work internationally on standards? Is it to incorporate those requirements for transparency into your regulations? What are your first, I know probably all of the above, but what are the first steps?
Great questions. By the way, FDA is hiring if you're interested, because he's hitting all the salient issues. Number one is standards. If you think about it, blockchain is ultimately largely about tracking an asset. In our case, it's food, but you got to have the common language. And for blockchain to scale, you've got to have standards, whether it's product coding standards, facility standards. So those standards. And you're right, food system is global in nature, so you've got to do some work with your international partners, and there are already standard bodies out there in the private sector and NGOs that create standards, but to really anchor down on what are the standards or the data attributes that you want to track on blockchain. The public sector's role in figuring that out, communicate it clearly, then allows the private sector to scale solutions that I think then are standards-based and interoperable, because without those standards, you have this issue of things will never be interoperable. I think the second thing then is, to be really transparent with you, is to use the public platform or the public, microphone to say these solutions have to be interoperable. I hear the private sector say they're going to be interoperable, but it's easy to say it now because nobody's really working on interoperability. But to really force that conversation and move it along, as you develop them, interoperability has to be front and center for these things to really scale and something as broad as the food system. So those are two natural places to start. I think it's what I call pulling the levers that will allow the technology to scale. Yeah, we could do pilots, but I tell my team I'm not that interested in pilots. I've seen enough pilots know that the technology can work. But what's the public sector's role to allow these solutions to scale in a way that's trusted by society? And then the trust issue is a big one. These ecosystems will emerge. They're already emerging. You've heard about companies that are adopting them. They're creating their different nodes, and I don't know how each and every one of them are creating their node systems and forms of self-governance. But at some point, I think we have to toy with the idea, well, how do you get academic institutions to be in there and be part of the nodes and part of the self-governance bodies? And then how do you get government agencies to be part of them? there's a model where government just rides along, and when they ask for data, they get to see it. But I think society is going to want government to be a trust anchor in some of these distributed solutions. Good questions.
Looks like
We're out of time.
We're out of time, but Frank, really want to appreciate
My
it. Thank
pleasure.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for what you're doing. Appreciate it.